So I do want to give a shout out to everybody that is here and simply start with this. Thank you for your work. Thank you for what you do every single day. You know, if we rewound a couple months and we were to look where we are today from a couple months ago, every one of you on this webinar have been asked to completely redo what you do virtually overnight. And you know what's amazing about you? You've done it. Like, you've completely redone what you've done. And maybe it's the remote learning side and pieces that we'll talk about today. Some of you, in working with principals and superintendents around the country, you're literally feeding kids every day and putting yourself at risk as you go out to feed some of our neediest students. But I can't start anything I do, whether it's a keynote, whether it's a workshop, whether it's just working side by side with amazing people like you, without saying thank you. Thank you for the work that you do every single day. Because I know it's insanely hard. One thing over the next hour that I'll be real. I'm one not to sugarcoat things. I'll just try and share it like it is. I was speaking to Sarah recently. Sarah is a third-year teacher. She's 26 years old. And here's what I know. The word is insanely hard. Like, look at her. She's exhausted. So hear what I know. We're 5 o'clock on the East Coast. I know you've been at it all day. You worked hard last night, and you go and you go and you go and you go, and you often give until you have nothing left. And that's why educators are amazing people. And we'll talk about taking care of you in the process as well. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I love to do this when I'm working with people, and even though we're remote, I still think it fits really well. I'm going to ask you to pick up your phone right now. For those of you that have been texting the whole time, that was really easy, wasn't it? And I'm going to ask you to pick up your phone, and I want you to scroll through your contacts. We're going to come back to this in an hour. And as you scroll through your contacts, and I'm going to ask you to do this, I know you're sitting somewhere in your house, that I know for sure. And I want you to scroll through your contacts, and I want you to find somebody that you love and care about that you haven't connected with in a long time. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and we're going to literally just pause for 30 seconds for you to show that person that you care about them, or that you're thinking about them, or whatever the case might be. You've got 30 seconds to make a personal connection. We'll come back to it at the end. Please do that right now. Ten seconds. Doesn't have to be a dissertation here. 10 seconds. Well, thanks for being intentional about that. Feel free to finish that up in the next few moments. We're going to come back to that in about an hour. Let me give you some quick insight into how I see the world. See this little girl right there, part of my whole world. She's at home with me, 4th grade, 10 years old, watching her remote learning, watching the incredible things her teachers are doing. She's truly part of my whole world. See this little guy right here? Yeah, he's my other half there, Caden. He's a 6-year-old. He's in kindergarten. For any kindergarten teachers that are out there today, I have no idea how you do what you do in a given day, and especially that. I've been partially that kindergarten teacher in the past couple of weeks. I give you that much more credit. And here's the funny thing, just so you can see a humanistic side. If we talk about personal connections, I'm going to just be very personal from the beginning and show parts of my family. See, that's the funny picture that I shared out on, my wife and I shared out when we took a look at kindergarten on that first day. Kindergarten teachers, you know what I really sent your way? Yeah, it looks more like that in a given day. Like, this guy is total chaos. I'm just going to be real. But I want to show you parts of my whole world, because when I talk about being personal, we talk about fostering these connections in a remote learning environment. They're part of how I see the world and through their eyes. And what is it that they need to really ultimately be connected in this environment? And so when we take a look at fostering these personal connections in a remote setting, the first thing that I will say is this is obviously more challenging. And maybe some of you saw that from the get-go, and that's why you saw this webinar to be attracted to it, because it is not easy. It's a lot easier when you can be side by side with your students. But at the end of the day, how do we make things personal and authentic? And here's what I know. It can be done. You know how I know? Because you're doing it. And what I see from coast to coast and the amazing people across the country and what they're doing to keep things personal, to keep the learning authentic at this point is absolutely amazing. My goal in the next probably 45 minutes or so before we take some questions is to give you some real practical ideas to make sure we're not missing some things and maybe our own blinders. I want you leaving with literally hundreds of tools and resources that are all free to help you in this work that I will share throughout. So let's talk about this idea around personal and authentic. And if you look at the right-hand side, we're going to talk about some of these areas. And yes, it comes from the book that they're giving away. I get that. I'm not here to sell you my book. That is not my purpose. It's to talk about these things that really work, whether you're in a classroom environment, but also in a remote learning environment. How do we do it? I want to give you a little bit of background. So I actually, when I was back in the district that I was in, I ran a K-12 virtual program as part of our public school in Pennsylvania where I was. So we actually ran full-time cyber, we called it cyber at that point, K-12 learning courses for our public school kids. And so understanding what it looks like online, there's a lot of challenges, and I hope I can address some of those, but there's lots of success. And I have so much incredible hope from what I'm seeing around the country. But we're going to dive into some of these areas, talk around like the social emotional side of things, as well as looking at the culture and how those can tie together. Looking at cultural responsiveness, I'll talk about that. And that's something we cannot be throwing out the window just because we're remote. Or these moments of awe or wonder, what do they look like? And how do we create those moments of wonder, even in a remote setting? Or things that are relevant and contextualized, we'll dive into that. How do we leverage students' interests and passions and strengths, especially in a remote environment? Creation and design, we'll touch on the technology, and you're gonna leave with incredible tools besides Pear Deck, and Pear Deck's one of them, but you'll leave with incredible tools and resources there as well. So some of the pieces that we'll dive into, but here's where I wanna start around this, creating this culture for learning. When we think about that, especially in a remote environment, here's my question for you to start with. What is it that you intentionally do to build the culture of your remote classroom or your remote building? I know there's principals and superintendents on here as well. And so when you look at it from a district end, we've got to look really, really hard and work really, really hard. You know, I've grown to despise this term social distancing, because to me, this is not about social distancing. Physical distancing, yeah, that's one thing. But the last thing we should be doing is social distancing, and being able to connect. These social connections, especially in a remote environment, are more important than ever before. So I ask you to reflect, what is it that you intentionally do to build that culture of your classroom? And seeing so many things around the country online and seeing teachers and how they're connecting with their students in a remote environment has been incredibly encouraging, because every interaction that we have is either a culture builder or a culture killer. You know, one of the things this past week, my daughter's teacher made a quick phone call, talked to her for probably 5 minutes or so, and my daughter cannot stop talking about it. At one point, we could look at it and say, hey, it was just 5 minutes. On the other hand, in the eyes of a 10-year-old, that might be something she never, ever forgets. Because truly, every interaction that we have is that culture builder or a culture killer. Right now, you're probably spending even a lot more emails than you normally have, or a lot more direct messages with parents, or whatever that can be. And every one of those little touch points is an opportunity to be a culture builder, even in a remote environment. My question for you is this, and I streamlined something that's been out there many times, but if we alter it to, when you think about every one of your students, if they had your attitude right now about what type of remote learning environment would it be? And so I'm guessing if you're hopping on a webinar at 5 o'clock, you're the type of person that's, I'm all in and I'm going to do whatever it takes. But how do we foster that type of culture in a remote environment? Because every time we bring people together, it really is an opportunity to build culture in our schools and in our remote classroom. You know, many of you are using different tools like Google Meet or Zoom or whatever the case might be to just bring kids face to face. My little boy is a kindergartner, as I shared earlier, and even at 6 years old, his teacher brought him together using a video tool. And I asked him, I said, Caden, what was your favorite part of this week in school? And he simply smiled and said, I got to see my teacher and my friends. That was it. It wasn't the extra worksheets or the packet or the thing that we were doing for science at home. It was I got to be with, even for just a few minutes there. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. In trying to make the webinar engaging and also reflective on your end, what I'm going to ask you to do, and you're welcome to throw these in the chat. I want you to think, it's a wide open question. It's not it's not a loaded question by any means. What are 3 expectations that you have for those that you're leading right now? So if you're a teacher and you've got 25, 30 kids, whatever, 100 kids, if you're a high school teacher, I want you to list what are 3 expectations and throw them in the chat. Wide open question. It's not loaded. 3 things that you expect right now. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do that. If you don't want to put it in the chat, at least write them down. 3 things you expect. Write them down. Go. So lots of good responses coming in. I'll give you just another moment there. Learning resilience, doing their best, trying their best, trust, participation. Give me another moment. Being positive, setting goals. So here's my question for you, and feel free to keep putting those in the chat. Now that you've listed those three things, here's my question for you. So how do you model it? Because when we talk about creating this culture for learning, especially in a remote environment, we have to model what we expect. If we expect our kids to be really good participants and stay connected, how do you model that? If I expect my parents to stay connected, especially in this environment, how do you model that? You know, when we think about it in a traditional school setting, sometimes we'll look, and I'll take kind of an egregious example here, maybe on that teacher that's back in that hallway, and I'm gossiping about another teacher in the faculty room, yet I walk into my classroom and I'm demanding respect for my students. I mean, realistically, like, how hypocritical is that? So how do you go to model? And I want you to reflect for just a moment on the things that you just listed, but then process and reflect. How do you model those kinds of things? And listen, we all know none of us are perfect by any means. We're going to mess this stuff up, and that's certainly okay. But in the things that you've said over the past week or past 2 weeks, as we move to this remote learning environment that you said you expect from your students, and I will tell you, I've seen things all across the board. I've seen kind of wide open, hey, like you can do this in your own time. This is not going to be graded. I've also seen you better be there at 4 o'clock, and you better be dressed like it's school, and you better not have any food. How we model what we expect, and how are we going to do those things so that way our students see us living what we expect. Because here's my true belief: whether it's in a regular traditional classroom or online, modeling expectations builds trust. And trust is really that foundation of relationships, isn't it? And relationships are truly that foundation of culture, whether it's in a remote environment or in a traditional environment as well. So I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different here as well. I'm going to give you just another few moments, and I want you to process. Let's pretend that tomorrow your principal comes to you, or your superintendent principals come to you and say, you're about to get a new student coming into your classroom, your new remote classroom. Here's the only data that we have for this student so far. This female student, in the past 14 months, she's been absent 35 days, and she's also been tardy 20 times. So I'm going to ask you to throw into the chat. I want you to think about what are thoughts that start to go through educators' mind. It doesn't mean that you would think it, but when you see data like that, and that's all we happen to have, what are some of the things that we start to think about? What are the assumptions we start to make? And so I'll take a moment, throw something in the chat there. What might some of your colleagues think, some educators, doesn't mean you would think it, about what that case is here if that's all you knew. And as we see them come through, certainly lots of great examples, things that often come out, but we often see things like, why is there no motivation? Why are the parents disconnected? Do the parents not care? Is she pregnant? And we go on and on and on and on, and we can think through all these examples here, but let me share one quick piece. You know why this is real personal to me? You see those data right there? That's those statistics right there. Yeah, let me tell you the next part of the story. That's the data for my little girl. Remember that little girl, 10 years old, that I introduced you, my little Paisley? You see, those were her statistics about a year ago. You see, what if I told you, let me give you another piece here, that over those absences, and those 35 absences, in every one of those, she was 2 hours from our home undergoing therapies for her food allergies. What if I told you that 3 times in her life, she's been hospitalized and we've almost lost her because of one seed of sesame? And so when I take that look and part of her story and start to share those pieces, you start to process, there's a story behind that data. It's so easy to make judgments, isn't it? It's so easy to look at something and to look at it and say, well, it's probably this or it's probably that. And we've all seen those types of cases. But when we take a look at those stories, what if I told you those 14 months later, she now eats 2,000 seeds of sesame every single day because of the therapies we went through? And I know that's real personal for me to share, but here's why I share that. Because a key to building culture is having the empathy for the hidden stories that are within. Those stories that we might not be able to see. And I will tell you, as we move to this remote environment, what keeps me up at night is students that came to us with traumatic situations, and you were their safety net in your classroom or in your building, or those students at home that deal with abuse or deal with those situations that sometimes we don't get to see, But when you take a look, those hidden stories within, and here's what I know, is I know that all of us, the hundreds of us that are on this webinar right now, we all have these. Like, let me give you an example. Maybe it's something you're super fired up for, something you're super excited about. Well, guess what? Nobody else on this webinar can see it or knows that. But maybe you've got something on your heart that it's heavy, and nobody else on this webinar, or the people you know that don't know, work at it, or they don't know there as well. They're the hidden stories that are within. I'm going to take a moment to show this video, and I want you to watch this. And a shout out to the video credit being to Franklin Covey. Watch this. I know that video hit home for me the very first time that I saw it, and I'm not afraid to admit that I had some tears rolling down my face the first time I looked at it, because for me it was so personal. There was things you just saw on that screen that have been part of my own story. And so my challenge for you is, do we choose to see the hidden stories in those around us, or just inside of ourselves? How do we make those connections? And of course, I'm not talking about like we're all just going to bring our drama to work and throw it down. But when we look at when we're connecting with that science teacher, is it the science teacher we see, or is it the person, that science teacher it is? You know, in our traditional environment, as kids are walking by us, do we see data points and test scores, or is it the heart of the child that we see first? And so as we connect with them in a remote environment, how do we still connect to their story? And many of you, fortunately, we've had a good number of months where we've been face to face, and you know so many of these stories from the get-go, and you know those students on your heart. When you take a look at your classroom or your school, which of those students are you most concerned about? Those ones that you know that gut instinct something wasn't right, or maybe you know flat out because of situations. How do you personally connect, because you know those stories in an environment with this, whether it's that quick phone call, that quick Google Meet, that quick message, or that quick personal email, or whatever is age appropriate for them, of course, to understand those hidden stories within. Because I really believe that the difference between making a judgment, like we all just did and I asked you to do, we naturally make those judgments, and having empathy, it's understanding the story. And the story truly gives context to that, because I really believe a child's story defines the context in which his or her learning occurs. And as your teachers and principals, you know that. You know those stories that you've had years ago, sometimes you can still remember, or even just this year in your classroom as well. And how do we make sure in a remote environment that we don't lose the opportunity with story and that personal connection? So here's what I want to do. I want to spend a little bit of time when we think about it. I've really been talking about, at the end of the day, parts of social emotional learning, haven't I? One of the things that I've loved seeing across the country in the past couple of years is how districts are doing an incredible job on the whole, really getting back to looking at that whole child, or whatever we want to call it, but ensuring the social emotional learning pieces are there. So if you're a counselor on this call, how can we connect virtually with students, principals? How are we leveraging our counselors, for those of us that have them? Are those types of support services in a remote setting? And I see districts across the country doing that by putting out hotlines, by sending, following up with kids that they were regularly meeting with and finding ways to continually regularly meet in that environment. Because districts that want to increase student achievement, I really believe, should start by increasing support for SEL. To me, that is core to all of the work that we do. Because if we want to push a child's mind, we must utilize the lever that starts at the heart. Because we all know, especially in this environment, how many of you are facing, and you don't have to answer this in the chat, but just to process, when we look at the fear that's out there with the coronavirus, many of us are teaching students whose parents are struggling with that. And then they turn on the news and they're looking at mom that's in the hospital, or grandma that's in the hospital, or quarantined in their own home, and they're scared out of their mind. And then sometimes it's our natural inkling to be like, why haven't you done worksheet number 4? And so when we see that disconnect, we have to remember who we teach and always put them before what we teach in that regard. Because if we care more about a child's academic accolades than we do about his or her heart, we have totally lost our way as educators. And connecting with that heart first is so vital. I know when we work that we've got to teach hard. I understand teach hard, kind of that work hard. But you know what? We've got to love them harder in the regard that we do. And what I know about amazing educators like you are the only people in the world, in my opinion, some of the only people in the world that go to bed worried about other people's children. But that speaks to the heart that you have and the amazing person that you are. So I want to spend a little bit of time hitting on some other areas that I think are so relevant, especially in a remote environment. So when I was writing Personal and Authentic, one of the things that I recognized is Tom Murray here, as a white male, has one lens, and I fully recognize that. So one of the pieces there is I asked my good friend, Dr. Rosa Perez Isaiah, whose life story is very different than mine, to really co-author this section, but I want to put it on your plates and my radar. Sometimes people will look at it and say, well, Tom, why is the white guy? Why are you referencing something around cultural responsiveness? This shouldn't be. And listen, I am one voice of many, and there's many voices you need to be listening to here, and I'll be the first to admit it, but I also look at it as my moral and ethical obligation to make sure that we are calling these things out and very conscious of it in all of our work. I want you to take a moment to read some of Rosa's words here around language and culture and ethnicity, color, gender, and the factors that contribute to learning. And so my question for you as you process, what can that look like for you in a remote environment? How can we celebrate those types of things in our activities? What does that look like? What are the books that we're asking kids to read in a remote environment? Give you one quick example. One of the things I often will ask if I'm in a school or in a district and we are face-to-face, but we can really answer it in the exact same way in a remote environment. What are the literature we're asking our kids to read? And when we take a look at something like just the literature we've asked, and if you're a teacher here, think about the last 4 or 5 stories that you've asked kids to read. Is it a diverse list there? Or sometimes are we reinforcing stereotypes by some of the literature that we're reading? Because how do we work to recognize in this work our own bias and our own lens to ensure an inclusive experience? Because when we think about this, when we think about being quarantined, when we think about being at home, one of the pieces I'll touch on later is equity. Every one of you is sitting somewhere that has Wi-Fi, so you obviously have connectivity, which right then and there puts us at a privilege above many of our students. About 12 million of our nation's students don't have connectivity. And how many of us have thought about that today? And I'm guessing because you're amazing people, many of you have, for those students that you might have that aren't connected. But do we recognize our lens as one way of seeing that? Because learning cannot be personal if the person doesn't feel like they belong in the conversation or in that classroom. So how do we create that inclusive environment, even in something like a Zoom meeting per se? How can we recognize and celebrate students' unique cultural backgrounds during remote learning? And let me just give you one quick example. I read something from Zaretta Hammond, and I'm a huge fan of her work around cultural responsiveness and sensitivity. But take a moment to look at some of the protocols. She released this in an ASCD article recently, and I loved it because to me, this is completely in parallel with something like remote learning. As we're having discussions questions online, as we have an entire class with us in that environment, or if we're using discussion boards. But take a moment to look at some of those pieces that she offers. And I think it's really incredibly brilliant that we look at the structure and the time for things such as small talk and enabling that, those personal connections, and allowing time for that, or using protocols to really shake up some of the inequitable participation. We all know what that looks like. Who are those talkers in that environment versus who are those that are more reserved? You know, it's really interesting. I was talking to my real good friend, Ken Shelton, if anybody knows Ken. He's incredible work actually just a few minutes ago. And we were actually talking about, for some students, they might actually feel safer at home than they have in the past, because sometimes kids go to school and it can actually be traumatic for them. And that's not any sort of condescendence to any sort of educator by any means, but we know that around whether it's bullying or racism and those kinds of things. But I love her work here in that, because as we facilitate online conversations, as we facilitate things like discussion boards, really having that protocol for equity around this is a tremendous idea, and all credit to her, of course, in that regard. You see, for learning to be personal and authentic, we have to respect the differences in our learners and really give them the flexibility that they need to thrive. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Just want to remind everybody, I see social media is very heavy right now. Encourage you to use the hashtag AuthenticEDU, and obviously tweet out to Pear Deck there as well. Well, let's talk about this piece here as well. And I want you to think about the instruction that's happening. And here's what I know. When I ran that program in our public school, that virtual environment for those 3 years, what I know is our natural tendencies are really baby steps towards it. And here's what I know. This is really emergency teaching online is what it is. Some of you were asked, you found out on a Friday and you learned Friday afternoon that come Monday or Tuesday, you're going to have to do it. So listen, the last thing we can expect of ourselves is perfection. And one thing I love about educators, know about educators, is we tend to be kind of perfectionists. I'm going to tell you, don't do that. It's all right. It's going to be okay. We'll talk about failing forward in a little bit. But when we talk about these things, one of the natural tendencies when we start moving things to a remote environment is to take what we've done and just put it online. So I kind of take my notes, or I take my questions, or here's the reading, here's the assignments, answer these questions and submit it back. Where are those moments of awe, and what can they look like? You know those moments I'm talking about, those light bulb moments, those moments of wonder. And some might look at it and say, well, this isn't going to have an opportunity to do it all. And I would say we've got amazing opportunity to do it now. Those moments of wonder, when I see kids outside, my son yesterday did his work last night for science was to go out and observe the stars and talk about with somebody at home what he saw. And those moments of awe, those moments of wonder and looking through it, it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to include technology. So what do those moments look like in your remote classroom, those moments of wonder, those moments of awe? And guys, I'm realistic. I understand this can't be every moment of every day, but if kids go months without those moments and really just busy work, I think we've missed an opportunity. Those kinds of things that we want to do, or those things that we said, I wish we had time for. My biggest advice right now would really be just try it. Like if we can't take that risk and try something new or try something, and even if it doesn't go so well, it's okay. I think we're going to be given all the grace in the world right now compared to maybe where we would be traditionally. And so now's the time to try those kinds of things, those moments of awe, those moments of wonder. Because what can happen in our classrooms online tomorrow that has kids running back virtually the next day? And I know it's possible because I see amazing educators just like you doing that every single day. You see, personal and authentic learning cannot happen in our remote classrooms if they're simply information rich, but experience poor. One of the greatest things that I've seen from teachers all across the country is really working and focusing on creating experiences. And how do we create experiences for kids to wonder and kids to explore really the world around them while they're at home? And I know that's something educators are doing an amazing job of. But let me talk about a couple other areas for just a few minutes. When we take a look at something like relevant and contextualize, I remember when I taught fourth grade, and especially when I taught middle school, kids would constantly, why are we learning this? Why are we learning this? Why are we learning this? And I'm sure we've all heard that. And we think about how do we make things relevant? How do we make things more contextualized so they understand it in context at this point in time? Because without a connection to the why, learning is really easily stifled. And so one of the pieces that I continue to see online, and I know you come from hundreds of different districts and different expectations in different places, but I continue to see the idea that less is more. The idea is not to quote unquote cover everything we traditionally do. How do we pare that back so kids can make this relevant and contextualized connections. Why? Because when we understand the relevance of things, or we can see it in context, we have a far greater understanding longer term. And so as maybe we pare back some of the length of things that we do, can we go a bit deeper, because less can really be more. But how are we also leveraging the interests and passions and strengths? Now is the time. And this is something that I know many of you, I'm sure, have done an amazing job throughout the year. But when we think about moving things online, what an opportunity. Well, when we leverage the internet, when we leverage connectivity for interests and passions and strengths. And I want you to think about just the past couple of days. If you're a teacher, or you're coaching teachers or principals, where have we had given the opportunity to do that? To leverage the interests of students, or the passions that they have, the strengths they have. Because as we take a look, what an amazing opportunity that we have to do this in such an environment, regardless of what the subject area might be. Another area to look at, because I really believe, let me jump back here for a moment actually, because amplifying those interests and passions and strengths in our learners, you know what it does? I really believe it recognizes the beautiful uniqueness and shows them that who they are really matters. When we give them options, when we give them voice, when we give them choice to take what they're passionate about and run with it, of course aligned to our standards, or of course aligned to the content that we want, it shows them that who they are really does matter. Let me touch on a couple other areas here. When I take a look here for a moment, I want to touch on creation and design, because I know when we look at the remote side of things, where you want to look, and we jump quite often heavy tool based. And I've always been the person that says, look, when you go to that conference and the session is just 60 apps in 60 minutes, like run the other way. But here's what I know. Tools are very important, but let's talk about the why behind it. And that's really around creation and design. One of the things as we look remote, we're leveraging technology really more than ever before. When we take a look here, our types of devices that our students are using in our remote classroom, are they used to leverage a digital worksheet storage hub? Are they being pathways to unleash student genius? And I don't see that in some sort of utopian-esque thought. I mean it because I see it happening in schools just like yours every single day across the country. See, if all we're doing is digitizing what we've done and taking that worksheet and putting it on a Google Doc, and no knock against Google, I love Google, but if that's all we've done, we're not going to get any sort of different results. We can't just replicate in that regard. Let me talk about the effective use, of ed tech for just a moment here. So in my work at Future Ready Schools, and I'll reference that towards the end here a little bit, we spent about a year working with Linda Darling Hammond and her team at Stanford University. Linda is one of the top-known educational researchers in the world, to look at, when we boil down ed tech, what is it that really works? And I could talk about this for just an hour. I'm going to just give it in just a minute. Number one, how in remote learning can we make things interactive? And so one of those pieces, fortunately, there's lots of tools, lots of great resources out there to help you do that. I'm going to point you to lots of those. I promised you hundreds of resources, and I'm not kidding when I say that. I'm going to point you to those in just a couple minutes here. Number two, it's the use of technology to explore, to design, to create, not just the digital drill and kill. And one of the things in a traditional environment that I'll really push teachers on, if all we're doing is digitizing that past practice and that digital drill and kill, we are not changing anything. However, when we use it to explore, to design, to create, it's eerily similar to like Webb's depth of knowledge or Bloom's taxonomy, isn't it? Why? Because great teaching is great teaching. And the third piece is it's the right blend of teachers and technology. And really, that's not talking blended learning and that buzzword. What that really means there is around how what's right for one kid is different from another. And great teachers have always known that. So I created this visual with an artist for the book to take a look at, to help us envision. So my question for you is, in a remote environment, how can we help kids explore some of the content? How can we help them design in some of those pieces? And of course, it's got to be age appropriate, but where do we unleash their creativity and their creative side? Again, now is such an opportunity to do that, as opposed to the overconsumption. Like, consumption in and of itself isn't inherently bad. We will do it to rationalize, to make decisions, to critically think. But I will tell you, I take my 6-year-old little boy, if I let him watch YouTube Kids all day long, he would do it for 24 hours a day, and he would look like a zombie when he's done. And I'm not saying he can't learn things in that environment, but it's going to be low level. So as we leverage technology, can we explore, design, create? And it's why I give a shout out to Pear Deck. And I don't work for Pear Deck, but I just respect the heck out of them, because the incredible tools that they offer to be able to support you in the classroom and support this type of environment truly. But I want you to write down a URL. So So take a look at this URL, and I'll remind you, bit.lys are case sensitive. There's over 300 digital tools here that you can use. Now, hear me out for a moment. I have not vetted every one of them for the privacy in your state or in your country, because we're all around the world here. But what this document is this document is a collaboration of probably, I would say, about 700 teachers that I've worked with over the past 2 years, where they've put in their areas around back channeling or storytelling or open education resources. There's so many things categorized by groups. So I encourage you, please take a picture of that, write that down, and here's what I'm giving you permission to do. You are welcome to copy that Google Doc and do anything that we want with it. Well, don't sell it, because that wouldn't be a good thing, but share it with the people around. Why? Because we are in this work together. So regardless of what you teach, if you're a special area teacher, there's probably things there for you. Science teachers have added their go-to resources and tools, and I encourage you to check that out, because we talk about making things personal. We talk about making it authentic in a remote environment. There's 300 tools that teachers have said, these are my go-tos, and I encourage you to check those out. But I want to pause for a little bit, because I'm throwing out lots of different areas, lots of different things that you're already doing well and doing it, lots of different tools. I also believe we need to proceed here with caution. For instance, I'm guessing you've all seen, I've seen Zoom. I've used Zoom for a couple of years, and we've all seen everybody jumps on Zoom, and then like 3 weeks later, we start to see what? We're using Zoom right now, and we start to see things online about chaos and security, and now this district can't, and those things. We do have to proceed with caution. And I want you to take a look at this for a moment. I'm not going to read all 10 to you. One of my best friends in the world, Eric Scheninger, an incredible, incredible leader. We co-authored Learning Transformed together. Just this past Sunday, he put out 10 remote learning practices to avoid. And I want you to process those there as well. Because when we talk about making things personal or those connections, there's also massive pitfalls if we're not careful. Posting assignments with no plan, relying solely on low-level worksheets, thinking we've got to stick to just that traditional school day. Now, I know some of your districts, they might be requiring that. But when we take a look and we give some examples there, there's also some things, and I love how he laid that out. I encourage you to check out his blog post on it related to that. But I want you to process, is there something there that you're thinking, maybe I need to rethink that? Because it's not always just about the things we can do. It's also the things we've got to be careful that we don't do as well. So one other thing that I really want to bring your attention to as well is take a look at the visual, if you would, on the left. I saw that on social media, and I don't have a credit for it. There was no source to it. Work from home and submit your assignments online, they say, and look at the picture. How do you ensure equity in the work that you're doing? Because if we're going to talk about remote connections and those kinds of things, this cannot just be a conversation for kids that have connectivity. It cannot just be a conversation in that regard. So I work out of Washington, D.C. Part of my role is working with the FCC. We've been doing a lot of campaigns to support home internet access for kids that don't have it. So to give you some one resource, check out, I encourage you for your local area, is everyoneon.org, everyoneon.org. They support low-cost Wi-Fi in your areas. I know many, many districts are leveraging hotspots and taking a look. We are working for educators to help you all advocate and get money from the FCC to be able to support those things for home learning there as well and support districts with that. But if we're requiring these things online, which many of them, if not all of us on this call are, we've got to be super conscious of the kids that cannot. And many times it's our traditionally marginalized groups of students. About 12 million of the students in the United States, disproportionately it's our Black and Hispanic students, don't have internet access at home. And so yet if we're requiring things, we need to have a plan. And I'm so proud to see so many districts running to that and running to that. But if you've got a student that isn't logging in, let's not first start the blame game of wondering what's wrong with them. How many of our students might say, well, we have connectivity and we have a device at home, and leave out the part of there's 5 children that are expected to work on that device throughout given days. And so flexibility and grace here is something that's really needed. Ken Shelton co-authored that section with me. And if you take a look at something Ken and I wrote, it's that ensuring equity isn't about checking a box. It's about analyzing what that need is, developing that plan, and providing it to each learner for access and opportunities. One thing that this remote learning has done, it has exacerbated equity issues. And so my plea for you, I plead with you to look at those students in your classroom, look at those students in your building who does not have connectivity. Because right now we want to think about not just the level of teaching by any means. I'd hate to even say that's the least of our worries in these cases, because of course it's important. But for our students that don't have any opportunity, how can we support them and show them that they matter? And what's a plan that we can support there? And if you're a teacher, I encourage you to have that conversation with your principal or your superintendent. But if we're going to make things personal and authentic, here's my plea for you as well. give yourself enough grace in the coming weeks to fail, because it's not if, it's when. How are you going to fail forward in this work? How are you going to try something new and say, you know what, it didn't work? And that's okay. Because every one of you, what's really interesting to me in my regard is many times, like, we all ask kids to do brand new things all the time. And then sometimes as teachers, we're like, and I'm talking about myself here, we're like the most resistant to like want to try new things. And I'm talking about myself when I say that. So how are you going to fail forward in this work? I want you to take a moment for a laugh. I think we could all use a laugh, and enjoy this video.
We'll bring you on into the temps, and we're all doing okay. Wow, 750 degrees in Gila Bend right now. And 1,270 in Ahwatukee. Now I'm not authorized to evacuate Ahwatukee, but this temperature seems pretty high.
Cave Creek is really...
Yeah, Cave Creek, Fountain Hills, they don't look good either. And frankly, Wickenburg is a total loss.
Oh my God.
You might as well just get out of anywhere along this 60 here. It's very warm. Surprise is starting to heat up as well at 1,300 degrees. So again, the safe spots seem to be Chandler and Mesa. Scottsdale is doing okay so far, but you know, you're sort of surrounded by some pretty intense heat. So, you know, again, I'm not your dad, but I would get out while you still can. I think steel boils at about this temperature. So Cave Creek, there's probably nothing left up there.
Like, you know that feeling, like that was probably today, right? You had that remote piece all set up, and you were going to do the whatever it is, the Google Meet, and you were going to collaborate on this document, and bam, your Wi-Fi at home went down. Didn't work, right? Those things are going to happen. You see, failure is an opportunity for a fresh start, but really only with that more profound knowledge and understanding than you had the last time. And going back to what I shared earlier, how teachers, I really believe, are perfectionists. And trust me, that's a compliment, because you've got the highest expectations. You want that lesson plan to go well. You want that thing to be perfect, because you expect everything from yourself. You have high expectations for yourself. But give yourself, especially in these weeks, enough grace to say, you know what, it's okay. Didn't go well. Because here's my belief. You see, if we come across to students as we know everything and we've perfected it and we know all the content and we never make mistakes and our kids never see us make mistakes, you know what I believe? They can't relate to you because they have no concept of what that feels like. So it's okay to fail forward, because every time we fail, it's really an opportunity to model to those. Whether I'm a principal, I can model to my staff when it doesn't go my way. A teacher modeling to my students, how we get up and we keep trying for those that look to us for direction. It's called perseverance. And in that, life's one of the greatest skills, isn't it? But failing forward really is not just a mindset. It's about learning how to persevere through adversity. And every one of us is living in a state of adversity right now with the world around us. So how are you going to fail forward? What's something that you're thinking, well, maybe I'll try, but what if it doesn't? Now's the time. Because if we can't take that risk right now, we can't try it now, like we never will. Because now's that opportunity to be able to do it. But I also want to speak to you as an individual, not as the educator, for just a couple minutes. How are you taking care of yourself? And I'll be honest, I feel like a hypocrite at times when I say that, because I don't think I'm particularly good at this. What I know about you as educators is you run and you go and you go and you go and you go and you give until you have nothing left. And for many of you, you're trying to do that full-time teaching job. You've got 2 little ones running around the house, and you're trying to make sure that there's not war at home in the whole mix of trying to teach every day. It's total chaos. And so my question for you is, how are you going to take care of you? Because giving until you have nothing left and going and going and doing whatever it takes for kids does not mean that you run over yourself in the process. Because we have to take care of ourselves as educators to maximize our effectiveness during these most challenging moments. And what I know about your work right now is every moment is challenging. Every moment is a new crisis or a new surprise or something that's not normal. But it's so easy in your work to work 7 days a week and nonstop and burn yourself out and minimize your effectiveness without realizing it in the process. Because that's what happens from amazing people like you that just care so much. We spend every day recharging our phones, don't we? But sometimes as educators, we go months without recharging ourselves. And so when is that last time that you disconnected and said, I'm going to binge watch something on Netflix? When's that last time you disconnected and said, I'm not going to look at emails tonight? And maybe it needs today, after this webinar, you shut it off and you take your email off your phone. Because now more than ever, we've got to take care of ourselves, because educators are working even harder than before quite often. You see, if we're not careful though, the same technology that keeps us close to those who are miles away can also keep us miles away from those who are close. And so my connection, when you think about those connections to your family and your own children, and some of you are, feels like you're working so many jobs right now in that regard, do not forget about yourself in this process, because those of you that we all have those servant heart as educators, but I know that you are worth it. And take care of that self and yourself in that process. Let me give you, before I wrap this up and do some questions here, just a couple sets of resources if I could, just some takeaways. So I referenced earlier, one of the things in my day job per se, that I'm not a full-time author or speaker by any means, I run something called Future Ready Schools, and I encourage you to check that out. Pear Deck is one of our partners for Future Ready Schools. Thousands and thousands of educators across the country are involved in different ways. I encourage you to check out that network. If you want our resources, you can go to futureready.org/connect, and it'll really dump them to you in one spot. But incredible tools and resources. It's 100% free. We raise money through grants in different ways. Future Ready doesn't sell a darn thing. I would say especially for our 5 strands. So those of you that are principals, district leaders, librarians, instructional coaches, and tech leaders, I encourage you to check that out. There's tools, there's resources, private Facebook groups, and those kinds of things. We don't sell a darn thing. I encourage you to check it out. Why? Because we simply want to support you. Truly, that's it. The other thing that I'll encourage and I'll ship your way is I use everything that I use in different ways when I train or I'm working with districts. I just put out there for people, and I put out there to help you. And so if you take a look at the URL, it's the bottom there, thomascmurray.com/authentic.edu. There's over 100 videos. I believe all of both videos I used in here are there. 100 videos, resources, tools, all those kinds of things, diving deeper from articles, other voices that are out there. You really need to hear from far more voices than just me, that's for sure. For many districts, I know many of you are doing book studies and those kinds of things to keep staff connected, full study guides and all those things. It's 100% free. You don't even have to own the book to do it. If there's things that can support you there, I encourage you to check it out truly. Here's how I'll wrap up before we hit some questions. If we're going to talk about staying remotely connected and connected in that, well, in a remote environment, just like I would say for face-to-face, it really does come down to relationships. Do me a favor, if you would, pull your cell phone back out. And I want you to pull up your text messages, if you would. And about 44 minutes ago, I asked you to send a text message to somebody you loved and cared about that you haven't connected with in a long time. And what I'm guessing is many of you already got a response. If we could all be in person, I would ask you to wave your phone in the air, and typically 50, 60, 70% of the phones in an hour period wave in the air. And here's my question for you. We paused our day for 30 seconds for you to simply show somebody that you love and care about, to just stop what you're doing and just say, hey, I'm thinking about you. Let's catch up soon. I miss you. So who's that child in your classroom that could use that 30-second message as saying, hey, I'm thinking about you. You doing okay? Or what about that 3 or 4 minute phone call? We all know kids don't talk for the most part pretty long anyway. Just to say, hey, I'm thinking about you. You doing okay? Because when we take a look at those quick moments and we take a look at those quick interactions that we can have, I really believe when we become more concerned about what we teach than who we teach, we've totally lost the purpose in our work. And I've seen so many things around the country where we've really refocused on the who. And I'm not saying the what's not important. Please don't misread that. Of course our standards, of course our content's important. Of course they are. But they will never be more important than who we teach in that regard. And I challenge you, don't forget about your impact. One thing that I know when I taught middle school, when I was a middle school principal, when I taught elementary, when I was an elementary principal, when I worked district-wide, there were days that I went home wondering about my impact. There were days going home with tears in my eyes, wondering if I had the courage that it takes to do what you do every single day. And I want to remind you of the impact that you get to have, because I know in the grind and when you're working so hard and you're going and going and going, that I know quite often we don't have people on our back saying, you're doing a great job, you're doing a great job, you're doing a great job. And if you have somebody like that, you are amazingly blessed and fortunate. So I just want to take a minute and a half to remind you of the amazing impact that you have. You see, your legacy is not going to be determined by the content you taught. It's going to be determined really by how well you served other people. You know what I know is so unique about this period of time is every single child that we represent, and the hundreds of people that are on here, and all the hundreds of kids that we represent throughout, or thousands of kids probably from just this webinar. You know what I know? Every single one of them will look back to this point in time and remember this point in time. Maybe it's the day they graduate. And they'll think back to this point in time and they'll think back to you. So what are those moments that we can share with with our kids that are just, they're different and they're new, and that's okay. And if it doesn't go well, that's okay, because we've got an amazing opportunity, because your fingerprint of impact is going to remain on those of the lives that you serve for generations to come. And I just want to take a moment to remind you that, because of the hard work that you give every single day. The way I start off the book is something I say often because I really believe it, and I know that you believe this as well. Because I know the work you're doing right now is hard. I know that many of you have put in so many more hours than your contract says you're supposed to, because our kids are worth it. And do not lose sight of that in the process.